Hi, this is Kelly Sadler, and you're with Politically Unstable. Today, my guest is Fred Fleitz. During Trump 1.0, he was chief of staff to the National Security Council. He's now vice chairman at the America First Policy Institute's Center for American Security. And we're going to talk all things Russia-Ukraine today. Welcome, Fred.
Hey, Kelly, good to be here.
So let's get started with the tweets that are happening right now. President Trump this week tweeted, quote, "What Vladimir Putin doesn't realize is that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia. And I mean really bad. He's playing with fire." Well, Russia responded to that tweet at Dmitry Medvedev regarding Trump's words about Putin playing with fire and really bad things happening to Russia. "I only know of one really bad thing, World War III. I hope Trump understands this." Fred, what do you make of this exchange online?
Well, we're seeing this conflict in Ukraine enter a very dangerous stage. Putin has simply defied Trump and disrespected his efforts to negotiate a settlement. He's accelerated the conflict. But when we talk about how much worse this conflict could get, I'm afraid we're about to see that after German Chancellor Merz said that European states and maybe the U.S. are taking the range limits off of missiles that are provided to Ukraine. This means Ukraine may not only be attacking civilian sites and military facilities and energy facilities in the vicinity near Ukraine, they could be firing missiles at Moscow. And I've heard reports that some Russian generals have actually left Moscow and went to facilities in the Ural Mountains because they are anticipating attacks on Moscow by Ukraine. This would be a huge and very dangerous escalation.
Yeah, I mean, there was already reports earlier this week of Ukrainian drones trying to target Putin's helicopter, which could be viewed in Russia's eyes as an assassination attempt. What do you make of those reports? And where Russia is right now, how close are we to a World War III?
My General Keith Kellogg, who was with the American First Policy Institute, he's now the special envoy for Trump for Ukraine. He was asked by an interviewer one time, "What do you think about these reports that Ukraine is trying to kill Russian officials in Moscow? Isn't that inappropriate?" And the general said, "Well, no, war is hell. These things happen in war. If the Russians don't want things like this to happen, they have to end the war." And it isn't surprising that when Putin was near the front line, that the Ukrainian army tried to kill him. That's what happens in warfare. I know it's terrible. That's why we don't want to be in a war. I don't think we're near a World War III, and I think that's exaggeration for people to be saying that. I think when we're talking about that, we're contemplating Russia attacking NATO states or using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I don't think we're near that state right now, but I am worried that if Ukraine starts blowing up buildings in Moscow, if it can do that, how Russia would respond and how much even more intensive its attacks would be against Ukraine.
Well, we know that the Pope invited Zelensky and Putin to the Vatican to talk ceasefire terms, and Putin declined. We also know that President Trump is growing increasingly frustrated with Putin, who said that he would deliver them the terms for a ceasefire last week, and those still haven't been delivered to the White House. So how do negotiations progress at this point?
Well, there are some recent developments, and they're not all bad. It is good news that there were talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians last week in Turkey. It was at a low level. It did achieve a pretty large prisoner exchange with both sides abided by. There were talks on the phone between Trump and Putin. Putin said this morning that he's still interested in a peace agreement. He's going to provide an outline soon. And one requirement he will have is that NATO can't be expanded further eastward to include Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. I'm not happy about a requirement like that, but if this means Putin is still talking, that's a good thing. I think Trump's going to have to put fairly extensive sanctions on Putin if he refuses the deal. And I think Trump will start with very stiff oil sanctions and interdicting the so-called shadow fleet that's been transporting Russian oil.
So, I mean, when do you anticipate that happening? There's been reports that Putin's also preparing for a spring offensive, that he's gaining traction on the battlefield and wants all of Ukraine.
I think that offensive has begun, and we've already seen significant advances in northeastern Ukraine by the Russian army. And Ukraine actually admitted to this, and they never admit to Russian advances. So I think it was significant. My guess is that if there is not progress, any kind of progress soon in negotiations with Putin, that Trump could pull the plug and put extensive sanctions on Russia within 2 weeks.
So, what do you think about the legislation that's being crafted on the Hill right now by Congress, authorizing, secondary sanctions and firmer moves against Russia, given the fact that the president really hasn't done anything? Is Congress kind of stepping on the president's toes right now?
I think there's a bill in the Senate that I think has over 80 co-sponsors, which is extraordinary given how divided Washington has been lately, imposing tough sanctions on Russia, secondary sanctions on nations that trade with Russia. And I think it's good to have that behind the president if he decides to invoke sanctions. America needs to move forward together. And I think Trump's moving in this direction anyway. I believe that Senator Graham, who's behind this, has been talking to President Trump. So I don't see it as stepping on the president's toes. I think it's a sign that we can send to Putin that the American people are united in standing up to his defiance of Trump's peace efforts.
I think a lot of people out there are frustrated. A lot of Trump supporters are frustrated in what they see as a never-ending war between Russia and Ukraine and never-ending U.S. support to Ukraine, to a war that doesn't look like the Ukrainians can win by themselves. How tough and how blistering could secondary sanctions be on Russia and effective to bring Putin to the bargaining table? Because listen, I think President Trump has made very clear, what hurts him the most is all the deaths that are happening on both sides, especially civilian death. Every single day this war continues.
Well, Trump believes his America First approach, U.S. national security, to keep our nation out of unnecessary wars and not to start new ones. He doesn't want America involved in the Ukraine conflict, and he wants this conflict over. He wants the killing to stop. That's been his approach long since he won the 2024 election. I'm hoping that tough oil sanctions will work. If not, Trump can up the ante even further with very punishing financial sanctions by sanctioning Russia's central bank and seizing financial assets worldwide. That may drive the Russian people to red lines. That would be a severe step to take. But I think that is also being considered by the White House.
And why hasn't that been done? If not by Donald Trump, by the Biden administration, who, basically is responsible for this war. And not and kind of drawing it out by the slow walking of military aid to Ukraine when Joe Biden was in power.
Biden didn't have a serious policy on this war. He wanted to provide weapons for as long as it takes, but not enough weapons for Ukraine to win. He might have given weapons to Ukraine in 2022 when they could push the Russian troops back. He refused to do so. There was just confusion and fecklessness by Joe Biden, no interest in negotiations. Europe could have done more, but they didn't. But Trump hasn't turned to sanctions yet because he was giving Putin an opportunity to work with him through negotiations to bring about a better life for the Russian people, a life of prosperity, to end Russia's isolation. Rather than making threats, Trump put out a hand of friendship and offered negotiations. Putin has not accepted that hand yet, but I think it's too early to say it's impossible to get an agreement. I'm just thinking it will take longer than we thought.
And there's reports coming, a lot of from unnamed sources out of the White House that President Trump is frustrated at European leaders and the fact that they haven't really stepped up their support to Ukraine yet. How valid do you think those reports are?
It's extremely frustrating that nations like France and Germany have not contributed the amount of weapons that they should be contributing. But they're happy to complain about the U.S. support. Also, the approach of the Europeans has been really counterproductive. They would like to put what they call a peacekeeping force, but would really be a military force in Ukraine, boots on the ground, to enforce a ceasefire. That is, to attack Russia if it violated an agreement. Russia will never agree to a peace if we're putting European boots on the ground in Ukraine. That's sort of why Russia invaded in the first place. There has to be a way to end this conflict in a way that does not feed Putin's paranoia. I think there could be a ceasefire observer force of neutral states along the border, but putting French and British ground troops in Ukraine. The Europeans keep talking about this. It's a bad idea. They need to call that off.
I mean, couldn't that start World War III? If one of those peacekeeping force, boots on the ground from Europe was in Ukraine, that and lost their lives. I mean, that would trigger it by Article 5 under NATO, would it not?
That's right, but we'll never get to that point. Putin will never agree to a peace settlement if that is part of it. And I think that's pretty clear to anyone who's following this conflict. But for the last 9 months or so, this is something the Europeans have been obsessed with. And I think it's time they try something else.
I mean, do you think that's because of Zelensky? There's also reports that, perhaps Donald Trump would have been tougher on Putin quicker and faster if he wasn't so annoyed with Zelensky and just personally not like him and his negotiating style.
Zelensky's been a real problem because Trump's approach is to get a ceasefire and to negotiate the issues between the parties later. And Zelensky resented that. He fought against it, and it made Trump really irritated because Trump's view is, I'm trying to stop the killing and start negotiations. Why won't you work with me? And the Europeans goaded him on, and so did Democrats. Democrats who were out of office, they were goading on. Democratic senators were meeting with Zelensky, and they were causing trouble. So, that showdown we saw in the Oval Office, there was a lot behind that, but it was a message that Trump was giving to Zelensky was like, if you're not going to work with me, I'm going to walk away.
And what do you think the odds are of that? Because it was reported in the Wall Street Journal this week that, the president is becoming more frustrated with Putin. There could be sanctions coming. But another option on the table at the White House is just walking away from the war. Do you think that's a possibility?
I think that we may end our negotiations for now and implement tough sanctions against Russia, but keep the door open to resuming negotiations and lowering these sanctions if Putin will agree to negotiate in good faith. I think Trump is not going to give up on this easily, but he may have to turn to some tough measures against Russia before we can get the Russians talking towards a real ceasefire.
All right. Well, Fred Fleitz, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Good to be here.